We're going to shift our focus now to nutritional aspects and how we can strategize our nutrition to meet our exercise demands. So the focus of this lecture is going to be exercise and sports nutrition. So just to quickly review, the nutrients that we can use for energy include carbohydrate, fat, and protein. We talked about those when we were talking about metabolism. So carbohydrate, we know we get lots of energy from. Fat, we get lots of energy from. Protein, we can get some energy from, but it's not usually a major source of energy. So these are referred to as macronutrients because we need them in large amounts in the diet. The micronutrients include vitamins and minerals. So vitamins and minerals we cannot get energy from, but they're definitely important aspects of the diet, and they play vital roles also in metabolism and just overall health. Then of course there's water, which we need for normal physiological functioning. So as far as the roles they play, as we said, all are necessary for normal, healthy functioning of the human body. We know we can get energy from carbohydrate, fat, and protein. Vitamins and minerals are required for metabolic reactions and play a vital role in metabolism. Then water is just a major component of the body. So the general recommendations are relatively vague, but carbohydrate is usually recommended as to make up the bulk of the diet. So 45 to 65% of total calories, and most of those carbohydrates should be complex according to the recommendations, meaning that they're not sugars, they're not monosaccharides or disaccharides, they're more of the polysaccharides. Fat, 20 to 35% of total calories, and minimizing saturated fat because there is a link between saturated fat and cardiovascular disease. Then protein, 10 to 35%. Protein's a little unique in that it has what we call an RDA, recommended dietary allowance, of 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. And water is definitely recommended as part of the daily diet. However, the amount that you actually need kind of depends on what you're doing. So if you were just sedentary in a relatively thermoneutral environment, about 2.5 liters a day. If you're very active and more in a hot environment, 5 to 10 liters per day. So there's a lot of variability there. A lot of it depends on how much water you're losing as sweat. And then vitamins and minerals also have an RDA, most of them anyway. So as far as the nutritional recommendations for aerobic athletes and those participating in aerobic exercise, so assuming that we're kind of basing the nutrition around some type of event, that's what I'm going to how I'm going to set this up. And then you can tweak this depending on what you're doing, if you're just going through a training phase or another type of event that maybe isn't as extreme. But assuming that we're going to be focused on completing some type of endurance event, like a run of some type, a half marathon, even a marathon, maybe shorter distance. That's kind of how I'm going to set this up. And then just keep in mind that if the event that you're targeting is less or more extreme, you can tweak these recommendations as needed. So carbohydrates are going to be really important for aerobic exercise. So we know that carbohydrates are stored in the liver and skeletal muscle as muscle glycogen, and also in the liver as liver glycogen. So glycogen depletion is highly related to fatigue. So really what you want to do is try to maximize your glycogen stores before exercising. So I think of it as like filling up your gas tank before you go on a long drive. So you really want to maximize your glycogen storage before you start exercising. So as far as the role of fat, fat's definitely going to be used during an event like this, like an aerobic event. However, you're not really going to run out of fat, so it's not necessary to get a lot in the diet. People have played around with the idea of a high-fat diet and if that can potentially improve exercise performance, and they haven't had much luck in that area. So a high-fat diet, low-carbohydrate diet doesn't seem to really help for aerobic exercise, and it could potentially negatively impact your performance. So carbohydrates definitely, from the research anyway, seem to be necessary for optimal aerobic performance. So if you were strategizing to complete some type of aerobic event, as far as days before the event, you could participate in a strategy known as carbohydrate loading. So carbohydrate loading is just an attempt to optimize glycogen levels, as I was saying previously. So the traditional method involves a depletion phase along with a loading phase. So about 6 days or so before the event, you kind of go through a glycogen depletion phase, and that would be for a few days. So you do training, so normal training, even though you may be tapering on some level, it's still a fair amount of training, but a low carbohydrate diet. And that's kind of depleting your body of carbohydrates. So then you go into a loading phase where you maximize carbohydrate intake, and that would maximize your glycogen stores. So you taper the training even more, high carbohydrate diet up to about 700 grams a day, and you're trying to maximize your glycogen stores. So the rationale for the depletion phase before that is to try to stimulate the enzymes to be very active, so when they do get all this carbohydrate during the loading phase, they maximally store it. So some of the side effects of this, since the low carbohydrate aspect of it anyway, leads to mental fatigue because your brain needs lots of carbohydrate, irritability. So, and then also, since the loading phase is associated with a lot of carbohydrate storage, carbohydrate is actually stored with a lot of water, so that could lead to some weight gain. So that would be a side effect. So to minimize these side effects, what you can do is just modify it. So one easy way to do this is just shorten the depletion phase, or instead of you could just not have a depletion phase, or you just don't do as low of a carbohydrate intake, and that would reduce some of the side effects that I was referring to. So both of these strategies, traditional or modified, are both have been both shown to be very effective at improving performance, lasting over 60 to 90 minutes. So in other words, carbohydrate loading is not really going to be beneficial if you're going to run like a 3-mile race, like a 5K. So you really get the benefits of carbohydrate loading once the event lasts longer than about 60 to 90 minutes. So distance-wise for running, you're probably getting at like a half marathon distance. That's when this would be effective. Half marathon to marathon, definitely carbohydrate loading would be effective. For something like a 5K or even a 10K, it's probably not going to be overly effective. So, and then as you strategize also just before the activity that you're going to do. So like the day prior, make sure fluid intake is adequate to reduce the incidence of dehydration. Just before, a few hours before, carbohydrate intake again, just to kind of top off your glycogen stores. And then just before, maybe a little bit more carbohydrate. And then as something that's important to consider with carbohydrate is the glycemic index. So the glycemic index refers to kind of the insulin response that you're going to get to a certain carbohydrate. So usually the glycemic index isn't going to be that big of a deal unless you're talking about right before exercise. And not everybody agrees completely with this, but there is some evidence that if you intake some carbohydrate with a high glycemic index just before exercising, it's going to put your body in the storage mode, so basically stimulating more insulin to be released. And that's not really what you want just before exercise. So it's generally recommended that a low glycemic index carbohydrate, and something that your body can handle and it's not going to upset your gastrointestinal tract. So what about during exercise? So the body can use carbohydrate at a rate of about 60 grams per hour. And so during exercise, carbohydrate, the type doesn't really seem to matter. Glycemic index plays less of a role during exercise. Solid versus liquid, so you could get it in Gatorade, that would be the liquid form, or solid, like maybe a fruit or some type of gel or goo. So it doesn't seem to matter, whatever your body handles well and what you prefer. Most sports drinks are going to have 6 to 8% carbohydrate, so about 1 liter an hour would be sufficient for carbohydrate intake. The benefit of sports drinks is that you're also getting the fluid intake also. So carbohydrate intake during exercise is definitely important, and if you're exercising longer than about 60 to 90 minutes, Uh, if you don't intake carbohydrates, it's going to impair your performance. So, general rule of thumb, if you're going to be exercising more than about an hour to an hour and a half, you should have some carbohydrates available during exercise to help facilitate your exercise bout. And then, as I said, the fluid is important, and also electrolytes. So that's the benefit of sports drinks, because they usually have all this in there: fluid, electrolytes, sodium, potassium, etc. Some of the gels or goos actually have this also. So that's a benefit of those. Good thing about goos, you can carry them, they're light. And so if you're going out for a long run by yourself, and you're not going to have access to food along the way, so if you carry sports drinks, it's going to weigh a lot. So a lot of people prefer the gels because they don't weigh near as much. As far as after exercise, carbohydrate replenishment is key, because especially if your goal is to exercise again in the near future, you want to, assuming that your glycogen levels have gone down significantly during that exercise bout, you want to replenish them as quick as possible. So high glycemic index carbohydrates seem to provide a more rapid replenishment of glycogen, because they're going to cause that bigger spike of insulin. As far as protein in the post-exercise period, protein is definitely important for muscle repair. So again, during a long exercise bout, you'll have some muscle damage. So protein is going to be make the muscle more able to repair itself more rapidly and be ready to exercise again. Rehydration is key also. Again, sports drinks, because they have the carbohydrate and the electrolytes, seem to be a good choice. So as far as protein in the post-exercise period, like I said, it's really important for muscle repair. However, it can also be used to somewhat replenish your glycogen, believe it or not. So I want to show you a results of a study that was done years ago, and it basically is showing that with a certain level of carbohydrate, say 8 grams per kilogram of body weight, if you get a certain glycogen replenishment, and then if you added a little bit of protein on top of that, you get even more glycogen replenishment. So this is a good thing, because it's just showing that some of the protein that you're intaking can be used to resynthesize glycogen in the body. But the other aspect of this study shows that if you just add more carbohydrate, you get even a better replenishment of muscle glycogen and liver glycogen also. So this is just total glycogen levels. And then if you add more protein on top of that, it doesn't really help. So I think the take-home message of this study would be that yes, we can use a little bit of protein to help replenish glycogen if we're not getting enough carbohydrate. But if you're getting adequate carbohydrate, more protein is not necessarily going to help. So again, protein is important for that muscle repair, but you still, if your goal is to replenish muscle glycogen and just overall glycogen in the body, you really want to get adequate carbohydrate. So according to this anyway, about 1.2 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight would be sufficient. And then, like I said, protein catabolism happens a lot during exercise. So protein intake in the post-exercise period is important. How much do you need? As far as endurance athletes go, about 1.2 to 1.4 grams per kilogram a day. So that's, you got to think about that over the course of the day. But again, timing would be relatively important here also. So an immediate post-exercise period, you would probably want to get the bulk of that protein in. But if you look at the whole day, 1.2 to 1.4 grams per kilogram of body weight. So if you compare that to the RDA of 0.8, it's definitely more, but it's not extremely more. So there's no rationale, at least according to research, to intake more than what this is saying right here. So, and then you have to consider the intensity. So if you're training very intensely and you have a high volume of training, you're going to be on the upper end. Not so, if you're training just moderately, then you probably won't need this much. So it's kind of like a scale you have to think of, case by case basis. If you're doing an exhaustive training, yeah, you're going to be on the upper side of that recommendation. If you're not, if you're just kind of going through period of mild training, then the RDA could be potentially appropriate. As far as strength athletes and power athletes, carbohydrate is also important, but most activities that involve power type movements, strength, they're not necessarily aerobic in nature. So it's going to change how we kind of use the carbohydrate. So if we kind of relate this to football or basketball, what you get is a lot of high intensity activity really quickly. So it's a lot of anaerobic activity, but you need the aerobic component for recovery. So if you think of like football games, the play lasts anywhere from 5-10 seconds on average, something like that. But during that 5 to 10 seconds, it's all out, 100% effort. So a lot of the immediate pathway is taking place. But then when the play's over, their body's recovering. Then that's where the aerobic pathway comes in. And you remember, you have to replenish that creatine phosphate that may be used up in the immediate pathway. So to do that, you can use the oxidative pathway and primarily using carbohydrate. So it provides a quick replenishment of creatine phosphate. So that's why carbohydrate can be really important, and also in power type athletes, and may help in maintain your overall training by maintaining glycogen stores. So even though they're not normally going to get glycogen depleted during an activity like this, if you think of the volume of training, so days on days on days, if you're not getting adequate carbohydrate, the glycogen levels could go down. But carbohydrate loading is definitely not recommended in strength and power athletes like it is for aerobic athletes. So as far as protein is definitely important in this population. If you look at the recommendation, it's really similar to what we saw for aerobic athletes. However, the upper end is a little bit higher. So again, it's case-by-case basis. If you're training intensely, greater requirement. As far as timing, protein ingestion within about 3 hours after an intense exercise bout is thought to enhance protein synthesis. And then as far as the type of protein, essential amino acids, branched chain amino acids, which are leucine, isoleucine, and valine. Those 3 amino acids are called branched chain. They're thought to stimulate protein synthesis more than other amino acids. In particular, leucine is an amino acid that has been shown to stimulate protein synthesis and help with muscle recovery and building protein within muscle.